Hey, I'm Bob and I like to make stuff. Today we're going to make a new arcade cabinet for Mortal Kombat 11.
This video is sponsored by WB Games.
Today we're going to start working on a brand new arcade cabinet. Now if you've been around this channel for a while, you've probably seen the cabinet that I made about 3 years ago. It was made to play retro games only. It was really cool though because it had pictures of my family as superheroes on the side. It was mostly empty on the inside, so it had lots and lots of storage. But this new cabinet is going to be entirely different. This one is going to be made for Mortal Kombat 11. Now since this is a modern game, we're going to have to use entirely different technology. It's going to be running on a PS4 and the cabinet's going to be different as well. Since this video is sponsored by Mortal Kombat, we're also going to have access to the actual graphics from the game to put on the sides as artwork. The cabinet itself is going to be made in a few different pieces so you can easily take it apart to move it, which was one of the big downfalls of my old cabinet. Alright, let's go check out what's going to be on the inside. I made the old cabinet just to play retro games so the entire thing could run on a Raspberry Pi. And in those videos I showed you how to wire up the buttons and the joysticks and get it all plugged into that little tiny Pi. It's not powerful enough to run Mortal Kombat 11, so we're going to upgrade everything. We're going to have a 4K monitor here, and all the audio is going to go through this sound bar, and it's all going to be generated by a PS4 Pro. I've only got a PS4, so I'm going to test it on that, but they're going to swap it out for a Pro when we send the cabinet to them. But even though that's all modern, we still need to have an old school joystick and buttons. To make that happen, we're going to use this card. This emulates a PlayStation 4 controller unless you plug in whatever you want to it. Now you can plug right into these terminals, or you can use this. We're going to put a wiring harness on this connector and make it even easier to plug up all these controls. All the buttons and the joysticks get connected to this wiring harness just by sliding on these terminals, and then the whole harness gets plugged in right here to the board. And once you've got all the controls hooked up, you connect this board to the PS4 with the USB cable. So the technology here is really simple to put together, but the hard part is going to be building the cabinet. Let's go do that. I've got all the big rectangular panels cut out, and now we're going to move on to some of the small stuff. To cut these out, I've printed out some full-size templates of the shapes, and then we attach these with some spray adhesive. Now we can cut these out with the jigsaw. I used the jigsaw to cut out a few of these pieces and then switched over to the bandsaw because you can get cleaner cuts with the bandsaw and a thick blade. The plans we have for this cabinet are going to have full-size templates for all of these oddly shaped pieces, including the big side panels, so you can print those out at home or at a local office center to make all the pieces with whatever tool you have on hand. Luckily, we have a CNC, so we're going to use that to save some time. We've got all those pieces cut, so now it's time to start putting the whole thing together. Now this one's going to be assembled very differently than the last cabinet that I did. This one is going to be made in 3 separate sections so that you can take it apart in case you need to move it. The bottom section is going to hold the PS4 and the subwoofer, and there's also room for an extra controller and any other electronics that we need to stick in there. The middle section is going to be where all the controls are, and they will be routed down into where the PS4 is. Then the top section is going to hold the monitor, the soundbar, and the light above it. Once we get all 3 of those pieces together, we can stack them on top of each other, attach them to each other, and then put on the side panels. Let's do it. To get started, we're going to work on the control section first. The actual controls are going to be up here, and all this back section will be what supports all the monitor and everything above it. So I've got these pieces in place. They're going to be pocket holed down into this bottom surface, but to make it easier and to make sure that these stay parallel, I've made some spacers. So I can drop these spacers in place, push all these pieces together, and that makes sure that these two pieces are parallel. Then we'll put another spacer here to make sure that's parallel, and this one will go on the front face. I've got those three sections on. Now the front panel needs to go on, but it actually overhangs just a little bit. So we're gonna add a spacer underneath this board so that it can hang down 1/4 inch below this surface. I've got all the pieces put together for the center section. Now the control board is actually going to be a separate piece that will drop right down into this tray, and we're going to work on that later on. So next, let's move on to the section that's below this that this will sit on top of. The middle of the bottom section is going to have a coin slot in it, just like an old arcade would, although it's not going to be functional. We bought one that has all the guts in it. We're going to take this out and save it for a future project, possibly. But we're going to go ahead and lay this piece in place, trace the place to cut out so that it will fit in, and this will act as our access panel for the PS4 on the inside. Before we get too far in assembling this bottom section, I want to go ahead and drill some holes in the bottom panel and make sure to lift it up a little bit off the ground. And that's because we're going to put some leveling feet underneath it, kind of hidden behind this front face. So the front will be really close to the ground, but behind that we'll be able to screw these in and out to level the cabinet depending on where it's sitting. Probably a better way to do this, but I need to flip this whole thing over to put it on top of that so I can screw it on the same way I put on the bottom. So we'll see if it works. We got the bottom two sections of this finished. They're roughed in and setting together, and you can start to see this thing taking shape. Now the next step is building the top section here that's gonna hold the monitor and the sound bar and the marquee and all that. We cut some of those pieces on the CNC, so they're pretty much ready to assemble. But one of the things about cutting on a CNC is that the bit is round. So any inside corners you have are not gonna be perfectly squared off like they would be with a saw. So for some of these inside corners, we're gonna have to go back with a handsaw and just trim them up. I've got these pieces pretty much ready to put together, but I gotta make sure to do them in the right order. If I do the wrong pieces first, then I don't have access to put in the other pieces. Plus, before we put this whole thing together, we gotta make some holes for the sound to come through. I'm gonna go get the sound bar and the light to make sure we've got them in the right place. At this point, I'm just trying to figure out where to put the speaker grate so that the sound from the sound bar can actually come through. And on this sound bar, I can feel that the speakers for it are actually on the two ends. They're pretty far out. I wish they were a little bit closer to the middle, but that's what we got. So I'm gonna mount this pretty much in the center and then make a mark here. Then I'll measure how far that is from the outside edge and make a 3-inch circle that I can cut out and then put on the speaker grates. Since I'm going to be changing directions on this cut with the jigsaw a lot, it's going to destroy the top layer of the plywood. So I'm going to go ahead and kind of score it with my knife just to try to help that. This outer edge will be covered up with the speaker bezel, so you probably won't see it. Just about ready to start putting the T-molding slot in all of the panels that are going to get T-molding. And T-molding is a little plastic piece that goes on the outer edge of the plywood to protect it, mainly from just being bumped, but it also kind of dresses it up a little bit. Now to make this slot, you use a slot cutting bit, and you have to make sure that you cut that slot right in the middle of the piece, because on the T-molding there's a barb that fits right down into that piece. So make sure you do a test cut to get your bit right in the middle of that 3/4 inch width.
I took the guts off the back of the coin door, and we don't need all these pieces. We need something that just returns the coin if somebody puts it in right back down to the little slot on the bottom. So I went into Fusion and I modeled up some brackets in this piece. They printed in 3 parts and they snap together just like so that when someone puts a coin in, it will automatically return it straight out the bottom.
Before we move ahead with making the bezel, we're going to go ahead and do some other finish work to get this whole thing into a single unit. I want to go ahead and screw all 3 of these pieces together so that they are locked in place. I want to add some edge banding here and get the marquee put on, and then go over the whole thing with a sanding block and some wood filler to start to clean it up. I've got a lot of the holes filled on the surfaces that are going to be painted. A lot of the edges are sanded down. Now we're going to work on the control board. This thing is going to be able to drop right down into this big pocket, and it needs to fit right here. The side panels are going to interact kind of in this corner, so we need to notch out this corner. I'm going to do that with a flush cut saw and make sure I clamp this thing down first. The reason I'm cutting this in place is because this cut actually needs to be at an angle. It needs to be parallel to this face right here, but this board is sitting at a 9.5 degree angle, so by cutting it flush to this face, we should get the right angle on the cut. Now that all three of these pieces are locked together, we can drill some holes, because we're going to have to feed the wires from the back of the TV, from the controls, from the light, all that down into where the PS4 is going to be below. And since these pieces are locked together, we can drill through both of these sections at the same time. To make those holes, we're going to use a big Forstner bit so that we can put the end of big power cords or HDMI or whatever we need to. The hole will definitely be big enough. So I drilled through both of these pieces of plywood, and then it just kind of kept going, and it turns out I was drilling right down into the top of the center support. So if you make one of these and you drill that hole, don't do it right in the middle of that panel. I've got a couple of pieces of wood here to wedge the sound bar in place in between these two walls. I'm also going to add some stuff on the front and the back, and then something to hold it down, because we have to ship this whole cabinet all the way across the country. So we started making this bezel, and I was going to make it out of a 2x4, and it turned out that the way we had it designed was actually a lot more complicated than it needed to be. So we're changing the plan just a little bit, and instead going to make it out of a 1x4, cut down some of the thickness, and so because of that I'm adding a spacer to push the whole thing out. The plans we have for this thing will be updated and simplified. Now we're going to put a bevel on these inside edges just to give it a little detail. We'll do that on the table saw. All the vinyl came in for the graphics for this thing, and it looks fantastic. We're going to work on putting this small little wing piece on to show you the process, but basically the entire process is just scaled up to do the side art. And I'm actually not going to cover it fully in depth because I already covered this whole thing in the original arcade cabinet, so if you want to see very specific instructions, go check that video out. We'll link it down below. After a couple of coats of paint, I went and lightly sanded this surface so it's nice and smooth. Now I'm going to take off any surface dust with a tack cloth. Now we take some lightly soapy water, just a couple of drops of dish soap, and we wet this down. And the water and the soap helps suspend the adhesive on the back of the vinyl just a little bit, and it gives you time to put it on and slide it around and get it placed correctly before the adhesive really grabs. So now that it's on there, we just take a squeegee and start at the center and push towards the outside edge, and that moves all of the air bubbles and that excess water and soap out to the edge and pushes them off. Now that I've got all of the air bubbles out, I've got to fold the excess vinyl around the corners, which is pretty easy except for on these rounded corners. Here, we're going to have to kind of make some cuts up to the corner so that the pieces will fold over a little bit easier and not overlap too much. Now I've got both of these wings done. The process is pretty simple, it just takes some time and some patience, but now it's time to move on to the big side. I've got the vinyl on the sides, they're all good to go. So the next step is putting down this polycarbonate on the control surface. It's a little bit thicker and more durable than the vinyl. And the only difference between this and the control surface that I did on my old arcade is that this has really precise locations for the buttons and for the joysticks. So we're gonna do it a little bit differently. First I've got to get this piece centered vertically and horizontally on the wood. Then I'll tape it down so it's locked in place. I'm gonna mark the center of each one of these crosses so I know where to drill the hole in the wood. Then I'll go back and apply this vinyl and cut out that section so that the buttons and the joysticks can drop right in. Now I've got all these marks where I need to drill the holes, but there's actually two different size holes. So I'm using a silver Sharpie just to mark where the small holes are going to be so I drill the right size. I've got all the holes drilled on the control board and they work fine for these larger buttons. They pass through just fine, but the smaller ones are actually a little short, so they won't go through this 3/4 inch material. So on the smaller buttons on the back side, we're going to drill in some larger holes so there's enough room to get the retaining nut on the back of them. Now that I've got the polycarbonate down, I can go back and cut out all of these circles, and to do that I'm going to use an X-Acto knife so I can get a really fine cut right up to the outside of the hole in the wood. I've got the buttons in, and now I'm going to move on to the joysticks. Now the problem here is getting the center of the joystick centered within the hole that I already drilled. If you flip it over, you can't see where this outline is. If you do it from the back, you can't see the hole that you're trying to center it on. So what I've done is measured the width and the length of this entire thing, measured the hole that it's going to cover, and then subtracted those things, and then made some marks on the outside so I can line up those marks, and theoretically, the center of this should be the center of the hole. Now we've got all the joysticks and the buttons installed, ready to go, so we're going to hook it up to the wiring harness like I showed you at the beginning of the video. The controller works, we've got it all tested. Now we need to make a way to keep it in place. So we've cut down these pieces and added some pocket holes. We can set them in place, add some glue to the top of them, and then put the control board on top. The glue will hold all these pieces together, then we can lift it all out as one piece and drive in the screws. That goes in there, drops in place, and now it can't slide off. We're getting pretty close to the end here. It's time to put on the side panels and then these little wing pieces. To put on the side panel, we put some pocket holes here, here, and here so that we can put the side panel on, drive in the screws from the backside to draw it into the body. And then up here on this solid section, we're gonna drive some screws from the inside into the side panel to hold it up there as well. When I was putting the T-molding on this side, I didn't put any in this little section, and that's because it fits right underneath here. This whole corner down here is going to get covered up with another wing piece. I did some testing and figured out that because the soundbar doesn't have HDMI, it doesn't get turned on when the PS4 gets turned on. So rather than having to deal with turning it on separately, we just swapped it out with some inexpensive computer speakers with a subwoofer, and so they are always good to go when the PS4 turns on. The last thing to put in here is the marquee. We've got those graphics printed on a piece of Lexan, and then on the back of them is a solid white sheet to help diffuse the light evenly. We've just got to peel off this front and you can see what it looks like. Now I'm going to hold this in place so it doesn't fall backwards, and Josh is going to use a point driver to drive in some points to hold this within the frame. This is the same tool that you would use to hold a picture in a picture frame. Now that we've got the marquee in place, this whole cabinet is done. I'm extremely happy with how this machine came out, and I really hope the team at Mortal Kombat enjoys it. If you want to make one of these for yourself, we're going to have some plans available, and they are going to have templates so you can add your own custom artwork. I'm not going to show you any gameplay because there's a lot of kids watching, and it's definitely for mature audiences, but if you want to find out more about Mortal Kombat 11, we'll have a link down below. We've got tons of other types of project videos that you may be interested in. Check some of those out, and if you're not subscribed, do that as well. That's it for this one. Thanks for watching. See you next time.
This video is sponsored by WB Games.
On the old arcade machine, I ran, and the only difference between, what? Doodly doodly. The old arcade cabinet, let's do it.